The Bothy Storytelling Podcast is a member of the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. Welcome to the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host, Calum Lykan, with a very grisly voice today, but I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to tell you what's been happening. I'm telling you some tales about the events that are going on. The reason I've been completely remiss with my podcast is because this month I've been a Viking. I've been an old crusader. I've been riding in a sidecar. It's been a crazy time period. All work, and great fun. But I think what I want to talk about and tell you about in this episode is Vikings. So we're going to call this episode, It's All About the Vikings, or something along those lines. You know, I'm actually part of a Viking reenactment society in Calgary, but it's not just Calgary based, it's actually all over Canada and North America. They're known as the Vikings Vinland. That is the overall society, but then we have the smaller groups throughout all the cities. And we have in Calgary, Vesterheim Vikings, we have in Red Deer, Heimdall Spears, and we have up in Edmonton, Odin's Ravens. All wonderful people, wonderful groups that get together to, well, live the life of a Viking, the living history, the crafts, the arts. We have to make our own outfits. We have to buy age-appropriate equipment. We need to create items which are of that era. And then, of course, there's the combat, the actual fighting style of the Vikings, where we use sword and shield and axe and spear and many other implements. So that's kind of what I do as a hobby, but for me it's a wee bit more than a hobby, because of course I get to incorporate my storytelling into the Viking society as the society Skald. Now I believe there are maybe other people within the Vinland Vikings that do this, but I haven't met them yet, so I'm going to lay claim that I am the society Skald. It's a bold statement, but you know what, I'm going with it. But the Vinland Vikings are a fantastic group all over Alberta, all over Canada and North America. But the first event we did this year, it wasn't even a public event. It was combat training. It was actually a training weekend. So as I sit here and talk to you with my slightly grisly voice, because many other things have happened between this combat training weekend to force my voice to be this croaky, but as I sit here and talk to you, not only my voice is that little bit damaged, but my body is. I'm still recovering. I got old, and I can't remember when it happened, but my body started to break down at some point. At 41 years old, I shouldn't be feeling this way after a combat weekend. I used to do a bit of combat in Scotland. I was involved in a few reenactment groups, etc. I've been trained in a fairly broad variety of weapon techniques. But after this training weekend with the Vikings, I was devastated. My body was bruised, I was battered, I was aching, I could hardly lift one of my arms with all the shield practice we were doing. It was great fun, but oh my goodness, it killed me. So I decided I'd go back to my roots. I'd train in sword and shield. Now, you've got to understand, when I say go back to my roots, when I trained in sword and shield, a lot of the time I was using a small buckler or maybe a targe. Now, a targe is probably about, let's just say off the top of my head, 24 inches in diameter. Well, a Viking shield really should be something up to the regions of about 30 to 32 inches. So it's quite a considerable size difference. And when you're having to hold this all day, fight with it, protect yourself, then do shield wall practice, etc. all day with it, you discover how weak and old you have become if you've been sitting in a recording studio doing story recording or podcasting for a while. It killed me. I was exhausted. By the end of it, I could hardly lift my arm. I could hardly swing a sword. But I'm really pleased to say most of the people who went that weekend and went for assessments got them. 3 of the Vesterheim, and Vesterheim is a fairly small group. I think we've only now got 12 people. But the 3 longer term people that went for their combat training all achieved that and archery. Some of the guys from Heimdall Spears got it. Some of the guys from Odin's Ravens got it. So it was a really successful weekend. But more importantly, it was a great weekend for camaraderie, for fun, getting to know new things. I mean, I got introduced to a weapon that I never thought I'd be interested in. The Dane Axe, or the Great Axe. Oh my goodness. This thing is devastating when you swing it about. Great fun, but so fast and versatile for such a big weapon. So overall, an absolutely great weekend was had with the Vinland Vikings. But, you know, the combat side of it, I should explain, is only the tiniest bit. You know, if you come to a display, we were actually just doing an event over the weekend. I'll probably talk about that later in another episode. But if you ever come to an event and see us, you know, we're doing a few events this year. We've just done Okotoks. We've got Vikings in the Street Festival coming up. We've got the Cochrane Medieval Day. There's the Laughed House. There's the Camrose Canada Day. There's loads of events. And of course, the big one, Gimli, which is what I'm working up to at the moment. This big event where people from all over Canada, North America, and some of the British guys, because we're associated with the organisations and associations in Britain. So some of them are coming across as well. So it's going to be this huge festival and pageantry of Viking life. But that is the important thing. Viking life. See, the combat's only 30-40 minutes of an event. We maybe do it twice a day. But for the rest of the event, it's all living history. It's all about the crafts. It's all about kind of immersing yourself in the culture. And that's what we do at the events. But again, I'll maybe talk about that more in a later episode when we come back to Vikings and some of the actual events that we're doing. But the Vikings Vinland, I'd highly recommend looking them up. Their website is www.vinlandvikings.org. And if you're anywhere in Canada or North America, have a look. If you have a passion for the Viking Age, look them up. You know, I've always been into my history. I've always loved it, but I'm really enjoying getting into this Viking sort of stuff. It wasn't necessarily a culture that I was overly fascinated until, of course, I discovered that I am from the Viking clans. I am a MacDonald from the Isles. I'm a MacPherson and a MacDonald. So effectively, I have that kind of Viking lineage in me. I also have the, well, okay, I used to have the streak of red hair up there. Now there's very little red hair. There's very little hair left. But I still get the reddish beard, you know, which is the Scandinavian blood that runs through the Scots. That's where the ginger, as they call it, comes from. It's actually the Scandinavian bloodlines, nothing to do with the Scots. The Scots, I believe, are dark-haired and blue-eyed. That was the traditional and certainly bloodline of the Scots. But the Vikings, the whole lifestyle, everything, the combat, the history is amazing. But for me, it's all about the stories. It's all about those myths and legends, the god stories, Thor, Loki, Odin. It's all about the historical accounts, the Battle of Larg, Stamford Bridge, all the myths and legends of discovery, how these guys sailed and travelled round the world, discovering lands long before anyone even thought possible. In their longboats, sailing up rivers, over oceans, and just discovering wonders, and occasionally laying waste to them. I won't lie, they were occasionally just out for gold and wealth and new land, but sometimes they settled, sometimes they were good, sometimes they were all about the crafts and the merchant lifestyle. So there's such a broad range within the Viking life, within that historical tradition that we can work with within the Vinland Vikings. However, before we go into a wee story about the Vikings, I better tell you about one of our sponsors, the ATB Entrepreneur Centre. So if you're starting or building a business, ATB's Entrepreneur Centre is a great place to go. And I've mentioned this previously in other episodes because I go there myself. Of course, they can help with your banking, but they can also offer workshops, and that's the main key that I like to promote. You see, their workshops and networking opportunities are tremendous. They have such a broad wealth of things going on, from how to work Facebook ads to tax work to kind of presentation and development of your business. There's a huge wealth going on. I know there's in fact one coming up, the 7-Touch Exploding Brand Technique. It's actually run by a good friend of mine, Michael Dargay, on this occasion. And this is just an example of some of the stuff that the ATB Entrepreneur Centre run. I absolutely love them. They can help you with your banking, of course, but mainly this aspect is for the workshops and networking opportunity. So head across to atb.com/Entrepreneur Centre to find out what courses, workshops, what networking opportunities are available. If you're really intrigued, and trust me, this is going to be a good one, on Wednesday the 27th of June, if there's still spots available, book in to the 7-Touch Exploding Brand Technique. Michael is full of energy, passion, and is a fantastic man for marketing and branding work. So I would highly recommend getting along to that one and enjoying his workshop. And after that, I think a wee story is needed. So let's start with a wee creation myth called Why the Sea is Salt. In Denmark, a great millstone was found, and it was named Grotti. This millstone, it was said, had the power to grind out whatever was asked of it, and it was gifted to the beloved King Frodi. And of course, he was a man of peace and happiness and joy, and all his lands loved him. But he was deeply saddened when he discovered that no man could turn the millstone. So he sent heralds throughout the lands looking for someone who could help him turn the great stone. And word came back that 2 giantesses, Fenja and Menja, had been discovered. So strong and so magnificent they were that surely they could turn the millstone. And they were invited to the realm of Frodi. And they gladly turned the millstone, for Frodi asked for peace and love to be ground out across the lands. And for years the giants ground, and love and peace filled everywhere the millstone's powers touched. But eventually Frodi's heart started to darken. He realised that why waste such a treasure on peace and love when he could have wealth and glory? So he asked the giants to start to grind gold and jewels. And the more gold and jewels that were ground out, the more his heart shrank and shrank. Eventually, he was ordering them day and night to grind from the millstone Grotti gold and jewels, and his palace vaults filled and filled. And the 2 giantesses grew sad, grew angry at being treated this way, but Frodi cared not. He told them that they could rest no longer than a cuckoo held its peace or a song could be sung. And the 2 giants ground and ground and ground. Now one night their anger grew, and they decided enough was enough. They spoke to the millstone and asked it to grind them an army. And as they turned, they sang, and out from the millstone popped soldier after soldier after soldier. And once the army was ground, they unleashed it upon Frodi and his palace. But just at this moment, in the oceans, waiting for his opportunity, was the Sea King, my singer. He watched as a great battle took place in front of his eyes, and he decided now was the opportunity to seize power. He sailed into the harbour, and his men swarmed upon the shores like ants, hacking and slashing and killing all they came upon, until eventually Frodi himself was slain. My singer was delighted with the wealth he gained from this venture, but more so, he now had his hands on Grotti the millstone and Fenja and Menja the giants. He took them into his ships and they sailed across the oceans, and he ordered them to grind. Not gold, not jewels, not a great army. He wanted salt. For salt was a commodity that could make a man wealthy beyond his dreams. Day and night the giants ground. Ship after ship started to fill with salt until they started to lie low in the water. The two giants asked my singer, "Is there nothing else you wish?" But no, his cold heart wanted salt. They ground, and the ship slowly dipped and dipped and dipped, and once more they asked the Sea King, "Is there nothing else you wish?" But all his heart desired was the power that salt would grant him. And of course they ground, and they ground, and they ground, until one night, ship after ship after ship slowly started to sink into the depths of the ocean. And as the ship that the great millstone with the two giants was on slowly sank, Fenja and Menja continued to grind and turn the millstone, and the salt started to ooze out and head into the oceans, drifting on the currents around the world. And it is said that salt filled the oceans far and wide. And to this day, that is why if you put your finger to the sea, take a drop of its water and place it to your lips, you will always taste the salt of the sea. However, it is also said, if you ever doubt a tale such as this, head off the coast of Denmark, where you will see a giant whirlpool in the oceans. And if you were brave enough to dive down, 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 to this day, you would still see Fenja and Menja turning the great millstone Grotti, spreading salt around the world. And that was why the sea is salt. And you're listening to the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. You know, the Norse mythology and Norse tales, there's so many good examples out there. I absolutely love telling them, and I've still got so many more to learn because at the moment I'm kind of focused on the pantheon god sort of stuff. But there's so many amazing historical accounts and fun accounts. But just to give you an example, just of a few story options that are out there. Of course, you've got the beginnings of the gods, you know, the beginning of Odin and how the creation of the realms came about. You've got great stories of, like, you know, about Loki and Idun and her apples, how Thor got his hammer, you know, the stealing of Thor's hammer, which is one I love to tell. You know, you've got how Tyr lost his hand to the giant wolf Fenrir. The death of Balder, a beautiful and wonderful story. And then, of course, you're all working up Ragnarok, the end of the world. So many great, so many diverse, so many wonderful stories to tell from the Norse cultures. But you know what? I don't want to tell you one of them. I'm going to tell you a Scottish Norse tale from the Isle of Skye. And it's one I've been telling for years, and I think it just fits kind of on the back of why the sea is salt, those two strong female characters. I think this is the perfect story to back that up. Glendale in the Isle of Skye. Today it's a very beautiful farming community, a little cloister of houses, and it's a lovely place, and it always has been. Even going back in history, it was always fertile and had farms over it. But one of the most important aspects of Glendale is down towards the coast. There's a beautiful beach of shingle and stone. Now that beach was vital to a certain group of people, and that was the Lachlan, or the Norse. they had been scouting the islands of Scotland for many years, coming round the coast and seeing what was there. And they realised that Glendale and the Isle of Skye would be the perfect staging ground. If they could set up shop, it would give them access to Ireland and maybe beyond. So they plotted and they planned. They built ships, they made steel, they trained men. And one day a great horde sailed for Scotland. They sailed around the coast and came upon the Isle of Skye. And as they sailed into that little beach on Glendale, their eyes saw a sight they had never witnessed before. For there, on the beach, was a huge army. Never had they seen such numbers against them. The armies of the Scotia had formed. And it was said as the longboats of the Norse hit the beach, we showed no quarter. Swarming upon them like ants, we hacked and slashed, burned and slaughtered. The beach and seas ran red, the sand was stained. And we sent the Norse packing. Those that didn't make it to their ships were killed, the ships burned. It was said that you could walk dry-shod into the ocean with the amount of bodies there. But those that survived sailed home with the bloodiest nose they had ever received. But the Norse or Lykan were not to race to take such an insult lightly. They decided that they were going to come back to Glendale. Their original plan had been to settle and integrate, but now all they had was conquest on their minds. They built more ships, made more steel, trained more men. They were coming back to kill every living creature on Skye. They sailed once more round the coast of Scotland, but they knew that that beach could not be used. It would now be watched. But through their sailings they had seen a cliff not far from Glendale, and this cliff was tall enough to hide the ships, but not so tall that a man couldn't climb. This was where they would set sail to. This is where they would drop anchor, scale the cliff and gain land. And the gods were on their side, for as they came round the coast of Skye, a great har, a sea mist formed, hiding their vessels as they sailed, and soon enough there was the cliff. Anchors were dropped and now men started to scale the cliff until they gained land, one after one coming over the cliff until a suitable number had gathered, and they felt it was time to advance. They started to walk through the mists down the slope into the valley. But they'd only taken half a dozen steps when all of a sudden they saw something in the mist, something coming towards them. They pulled their weapons ready for attack and then froze. For what they saw coming through the mist caused them much confusion. They saw 30 women. 30 women standing in front of them, armed with sword, axe and spear, wearing chain and helm, and with a look in their eyes that said they had mischief in mind. The Norse did not know what to make of this, especially when the banshee wail filled the heavens and these 30 women charged, hacking and slashing into the ranks of the Norse. Many a man fell before the Norse could gather their wits and fight back, and there on the cliff top a great battle took place, man against woman, hacking and slashing. But all the time, more Norse were swarming over the cliff top until eventually those 30 brave souls were surrounded by the great host of the Norse. And the battle continued, but strength and numbers started to take hold, and one by one by one, those women started to fall, until the Norse were looking down at a small pile of bloodied, battered, dead women. They looked at these brave souls and gave them respect, for they appreciated the honour and fight within them, but they had come to do a job, and this was just the beginning. So the Norsemen gathered ranks once more, and were about to start marching down into the valley, when all of a sudden there was movement in the mist, sound of heavy footfall, and as the mists parted, once more the Norsemen were faced with the armies of the Scotia. Both armies stared at each other, vengeance, passion and hatred in their eyes. But then the armies of the Scotia, their eyes fell down to the ground. They fell to that small pile of women. And there they looked upon their wives, their daughters, their aunts, their mothers, their kith and kin, laid waste by this horde of invaders. And their wrath built, their blood boiled, and a great scream filled the heavens as the armies of the Scotia charged upon the Norsemen. And for a second time that day, a great battle took place upon the cliffs. Many a man fell, piles upon piles of bodies filled the soil, and eventually the Scotia started to gain hold, started to push and push and push the Norse back, until eventually it was the blades and wrath of the Scotia or the raging oceans below that faced the Vikings. And it was said that many a Norseman threw himself into the ocean, praying the gods would protect him, rather than have the blades of the Scotia fall upon them. But only when there was no breathing Norseman left upon the Isle of Skye did the wrath of the Scotia abate. And then they turned and looked with heavy hearts upon the field, for there were piles and piles of bodies strewn everywhere. But for the time being, there was only one pile that mattered. They gathered those 30 brave women, those brave women that had armed themselves and attacked the Norse to give the armies of the Scotia time to gather once more. Those brave souls that had sacrificed themselves for the many. They gathered them and carried them to the local village. There they cleansed their bodies and gave them a true warrior send-off. And eventually the fields were cleaned, the bodies were taken away. But that was not enough. Something needed to be done. So one day they gathered and carried a great stone to the top of the cliff and placed it in the earth, a standing stone. A standing stone to commemorate those 30 brave souls that had sacrificed themselves. A standing stone to commemorate the battle that had taken place so no one would ever forget. And that stone is still there to this day. A little bit more weather-worn than it once was, but standing true and proud to honour those women. And in the village of Glendale, you will ask about the stone. And although in the maps it's not there, although the land is named nothing, if you ask about the stone, they will tell you this tale, and they will also tell you that the land was renamed. Because forever the stone commemorates the land, which is known as the fields of the heaps of the slain. That was the Fields of the Heaps of the Slain, a wonderful story from the Isle of Skye. And it's actually a story that I've placed on my CD, Scottish Bedtime Stories. It's a CD of gruesome and grisly and violent stories from Scotland, all about the bloody, gory background of history and life in Scotland. Some ghostly tales, some gruesome, but a wonderful collection, and you can find that on my website, www.calumlycanstorytelling.com. With all this talk of Vikings and combat and warfare, I think that my book recommendation for this episode should, be about that, to be honest. And Audible has such a great collection of books on Vikings. Audible and the Bothy Storytelling Podcast are giving you a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial. I want you to remember this, because if you go to www.audibletrial.com/Bothy Podcast, you can take advantage of that. And remember that Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So my book recommendation from Audible on Vikings and warfare and combat is The Vikings and Their Enemies, written by Philip Lyne and narrated by Robert Fass. It's about 13 hours of audiobook here, and it's valued at $33 and a cent, or a penny as I call it. Still getting used to your currency, Canada. Love you to bits, but currency I'll never understand. Let's just call it $33. That'll be a lot easier. But bear in mind, this is a great book to get, because you can get that download for free with your 30-day free trial. So you could pick up The Vikings and Their Enemies, and it's all about warfare in Northern Europe, roughly from the 750 to about the 1100s, if I remember correctly. It's a book I've read. It covers a broad range of topics, some of the famed fighters, an idea of how warfare took place, and it's a wonderful book to read. But you don't need to read this one, because it's got 13 hours of audiobook. Plug it in, take a road trip. Let's just say head to Manitoba from Calgary. Plug it in and just listen to the joys of the Vikings and Their Enemies. A wonderful book from Audible. And if you type in www.audibletrial.com/Bothy Podcast, you can get your 30-day free trial and your free audiobook download. And we all know what comes immediately after Calum's book recommendation. It is our podcast recommendation. And as we are sponsored by ATB, I like to promote some of the podcasts that are available on the Alberta Podcast Network, which I am now a member of. There is a huge wealth of podcasts out there, but I was trying to think, okay, how do we tie a podcast into Vikings? Because I don't think there's anyone that does that. And you know what? Combat. Now, I'm a little ignorant on all sports subjects. You know that from the last podcast. It's not an area that I'm strong at. So I thought to myself, what is a great sport or a great kind of podcast I can do? And I found one. It's called The Fourth Line Podcast. It's all about hockey. It's about the closest thing I could get to Viking combat, ladies and gents. I can't help it. I'm not very up on sports, but I do vaguely remember that hockey was a kind of fun, hard-hitting, hard-punching sport at one point. It might have changed. I do hope not. It was always enjoyable to see someone getting slammed against the plastic things at the side. See, I know nothing and getting hit with sticks. Yeah, I'm good at this sports stuff, haven't I? But the Fourth Line Podcast, I'll just read you a little bit about them. No finesse. Just grinding out our opinions on hockey and hockey-related news. It's hosted by Carl Landra and Joel Schnell. Two difficult names for a Scotsman to pronounce, it would appear. But this is another one of the Alberta Podcast Network's podcasts. The Fourth Line Podcast, all about hockey, the closest connection I can get to Vikings and combat for you today. But I highly recommend it. These guys cover it all from what I gather. I don't even know what that is. High sticking? I'm not sure. what that means, folks. The Atlantic Division, Pacific Division, Central Division, Metropolitan Division, and the NHL. So they cover all the divisions. I'm trying to sound like I know what I'm talking about. I love it. They're trying to cover all the divisions of hockey and something to do with high sticking, if that is a hockey term, or that might just be something on their website that I know nothing about. Don't worry, folks. Most of you guys will probably know hockey. Ice hockey, of course. Hockey is a different thing. That's a group of people running about in a field with a wee ball. But you guys will probably know ice hockey better than I do. Please forgive me. Don't write in and complain about this Scotsman babbling about stuff he doesn't know about. This is my podcast recommendation. It is a fun podcast. It's all about ice hockey. The guys are great that do it. So get across to the Alberta Podcast Network, find them, and listen to some of their episodes. And that is my podcast recommendation for this episode. God, I'm going to get in so much trouble about that recommendation. I really, really probably should read up on some of the things that I'm having to recommend, because when it comes to sports, I am useless. Unless they use, I don't know, the slashing. And I recognise that term, slashing, and we do that in Viking combat. So, you know, there's the connection. There's my passion. But ladies and gents, we're coming to the end of another Bothy Storytelling podcast. I hope you've enjoyed my ramblings. I hope you've enjoyed the stories. I will remind you that we do have a Patreon page, the Bothy Storytelling Podcast Patreon page. Do you know what? I revamped it recently. I got rid of all the tiers. It's a basic Patreon page now. All I'm asking is go and support the podcast. $5. That's it. That's the only tier available now. $5. You support the podcast. It's the price of a Starbucks coffee. Come on, you guys can go for Starbucks for one day. I, of course, can't. I'm addicted to the stuff that comes with living with people who work in Starbucks. I hated it. Now I'm addicted. I've got a gold card. Oh my God, my gold card. Like, I achieved gold card status within like 3 months, and every 2 months maintain my gold card status. It's ridiculously addictive. Frappuccino season is back with us. Yay. I've just done a promotion for Starbucks. That wasn't supposed to happen. Just ignore that. The Patreon page though, get on over to it. The Bothy Storytelling Podcast on Patreon. $5 will support us. Basically my eternal gratitude. You get a few updates, hopefully a few stories. Just generally whatever I can do on that, but you always get the podcast there as well. So head over to the Bothy Storytelling Podcast Patreon page. But with that, ladies and gents, boys and girls, all species around the galaxy, thank you for joining me on another episode on the Bothy Storytelling Podcast. And I hope to hear, see, speak to you all soon. Remember, you can email into me as well if you want to request a theme for an episode, or if there's something you want to ask me about storytelling, or just shout at me about ice hockey. Please don't. I'm really sorry. I'm Scottish. We're not very good at sports over there, okay? Just please forgive me, Canada, and the rest of the ice hockey loving world. I'll see you all soon.